Before the revolutionary James Watt, so-called inventor of the steam engine, British engineer and inventor Thomas Savery created a pump operated by hand-controlled valves that was used to clear water from mines. The machine, patented in 1698, used the pressure of condensing steam to create suction. After his work, another English engineer, Thomas Newcomen, improved on Savery's invention and made a more efficient steam engine in 1712 that employed a piston to separate the steam and the collected water. By 1765, James Watt had perfected the steam engine by controlling heating and cooling with a new water vapor condenser, and received a patent for the device in 1769. Watt, a seasoned mechanical engineer, had developed brand new technology that had the potential to improve processes in industry like no other device had in the past. It paved the road to industrial advancement, and with this newfangled contraption, the spark of the Industrial Revolution was in the air. By 1825, the first railway locomotive had been created by George Stephenson, an English civil and mechanical engineer, and the son of an engineman, as a result of years of experimentation with steam engines. His work directly led to the development of the first intercity railroads, which were built while he held the engineer position for the construction of the first public passenger railway, the Stockton and Darlington, located in England. In the United States, development of the technology was also well underway. Peter Cooper, an American industrialist, completed the first American locomotive in 1830. A passenger train, its construction triggered the creation of more lines, sprawling with miles of metal track, this time in the northern and southern regions in the United States. However, construction in the South was limited, while in the North it was flourishing, and this split in action between the two regions defined their economies. Here's Professor Jacqueline Baik with more on the topic.
Before we get ahead of ourselves and talk about the significance of railroads, we first have to take a step back and talk about the big picture, the economy. The North was never fully focused on farming and big plantations, simply because their soil and climate didn't allow it. So there was a necessity for other forms of profit. That's when industry comes into play. In the North, between 1800 and 1860, laborers in agriculture dropped from 70% to 40%, and slavery was almost non-existent. But industry was booming, and cities were established and populated more than ever before. A flood of European immigrants traveled to the North to work in cities and factories. Northeast America was emerging as the industrial core of the nation. They were in charge of 85% of the nation's manufacturing. They processed raw materials from the Midwest and West. However, the Industrial Revolution mainly extended throughout regions north of the Mason-Dixon line. At this time, the South was still predominantly agricultural and dependent on selling staples to a world market. Cotton was one of, if not the most valuable export in the United States. So Southern wealth came from plantations and farms, and as a result, there was very little manufacturing in the region.
It was around this time that Asa Whitney, distant cousin of cotton gin inventor Eli Whitney, entered the scene. Whitney, a well-traveled businessman, dry goods merchant, and railroad promoter, saw potential in the American railways for economic growth because of the possibility of connecting the industrial Northeast to the newfound West. With that in the forefront of his thought, he pushed for a bill in Congress in 1845 to construct a railroad that would stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In his proposal, Whitney asked for government grants of land to start the construction of the railroad, and sale of the land would benefit the settlers and pay for the railway. He promised to return excess funds for maintaining the railway or paying for public education. Despite the benefits of the plan, however, Whitney's idea was pushed aside, and even when gold was discovered in Oregon in 1848, with the advent of the California Gold Rush, action still was not taken by the federal government. Professor Spencer Lopez will speak more about railroads in the economy and its potential for impact.
Railroads go hand in hand with economic development and industrialization. In the early to mid-19th century, railroads truly took the nation by storm. Prior to rail transportation, canals and rivers were the primary medium of transportation. Compared to locomotives, boats, often powered by steam, were just not as fast, efficient, and often required whole canals to be carved into land. The efficiency of railroads played a big role, but the ubiquitousness of railroads truly was the catalyst for the expansion and development of the American frontier. With railroads, you could landscape, just plop down rails here and connect it to a major city, and bam, you have a fast and reliable method of transportation for people and goods. Isolated landlocked towns which had railroads installed became inland ports and oftentimes prospered and grew into cities. The North, which was known for leading the country with state of the art industry, embraced railroads wholly to fit the needs of their manufacturing based economy. Rails were put down connecting almost every major northern Midwestern city by 1860, and in the heavily settled Corn Belt, over 80% of farmers were within 5 miles of a railway. After the South seceded, the Pacific Railway Acts were passed in 1862, which would make a 6-day trip via the Transcontinental Railroad from New York to San Francisco possible. The South, on the other hand, valued agriculture to a much greater regard, and so most southern railroads were just a local affair, connecting cotton regions to the nearest waterway and had blocked any rail expansion westward.
Whitney's attempt at getting his bill through Congress was stymied by Southern members of Congress, who saw no reason for the South to benefit from the technology, and money spent on an investment that they would not reap anything from were seen as utterly useless. Regardless, Whitney went on a 6-year popularity campaign, but this had little effect on the push for railroads in the federal government. By the time his campaign had caught any followers, the nation had shifted its focus on a much more profound and ravaging problem: the tense contention over slavery. Regional and ideological divides between the industrious Northerners and the agricultural Southerners were so polarized over the topic that President Abraham Lincoln only strove for one goal: to preserve the Union. The secession of South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, shattered Lincoln's attempts to peacefully keep the nation as one. With the attack on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the start of the American Civil War, the play of railroads in the war became increasingly important in strategic measures by the military.
The North was on its way toward a commercial and manufacturing economy. By 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from the northern region of the United States. On the other hand, 84% of the southern region was still engaging in agriculture by 1860. This fact greatly contributed to the lack of large expanses of railroads in the South. The South only contained about 29% of the nation's railroad tracks. Because the Southern way of life required fewer internal improvements than that of the Northwest, they often viewed federal subsidies for such projects to be a part of a deal between Eastern and Western interests that included no benefits for the South. These differences led to many regional disputes in the government. An example of this was the Pacific Railway Bill of 1860, which proposed that a transcontinental railway link the West to the East. Southerners wanted a railroad built along a southern route, and Northerners wanted a northern route. The bill failed to pass the House, for it received no votes from congressmen representing the southern districts of the United States. They believed that railroads held no obvious gains for the South. By the time of the Civil War, the North had around 20,000 miles of railroad compared to the South's measly 9,000 miles. Once the Southerners left Congress at the beginning of the war, Republicans passed a bill set to build a middle route from Omaha to Sacramento. On July 1st, 1862, the Pacific Railway Act reappeared and was approved by President Abraham Lincoln. This acted as a literal as well as symbolic link between the East and the West, with the exclusion of the South, of course. All in all, differences in Southern and Northern interests led to a divide between the two regions in terms of railroads.
The population of the United States was approximately 19 million at the start of the war, and of this 19 million, 9 million were living in the South, 3.5 million being slaves. The South was an agrarian society that depended on cash crops for profit and staple crops for nourishment. At the beginning of the war, the Union neglected to utilize Northern railroads in their war effort. Most railroad executives focused more on the rates for transporting war material and the profits they would make than the welfare of the Union. After the South fired on Fort Sumter, Confederate raiders ripped up miles of track, which were left in a state of disrepair. While boxes of food and ammunition sat on sidings, railroad executives disputed with Army officers over the cost of transporting the goods. Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Secretary of War, had invested in numerous railroads, and therefore manipulated the rate that the War Department would pay for the transportation of its soldiers and material in his favor. Such corruption in the rail industry led to the enactment of the Railways and Telegraph Act on January 31st, 1862. This legislation allowed the president to take possession of railroads and run them as required to preserve public safety. Finally, government control of the northern rails would make them conducive for heavy use and transport of soldiers and goods for the war.
The South did not favor the construction of railroads, so much to the fact that they failed to realize the full potential it has. In fact, America did have about 70% of their railroads built in the North. During the war, the Confederacy relied on mostly manpower by concentrating their funds on military and artillery. But that only could get them so far. On the other hand, the Union exercised the potential cleverly through concentrating the funds of the government. But because the Union underestimated the magnitude of the war, the Union initially didn't believe that the use of railroads were necessary. This is where the Battle of Bull Run comes in. After this battle, the Union finally opened their eyes to the fact that this wasn't going to be a little sibling argument. It was war. In the first half, the Union easily broke through enemy lines. Okay, but the Confederates came back with a strong comeback, bringing the reinforcements through the rails, and sure enough, this led to Confederate win. This battle also introduced the first use of railroads at the war front. Like the Battle of Bull Run, these railroads were mainly used to transport military, food, and artillery to the battlefields. Also, these locomotives were responsible for communication. These railroads provide a faster way to send messages from the battlefield camp to the capital. It's definitely better than riding a horse through day and night. At other times, these trains would take a risk of receiving information about the position of enemy lines. Although it's risky, but we know that a locomotive's high acceleration can outrun any pursuit of men on foot. Oh, and telegraphs. Telegraphs were another piece of technology used at this time, but what can you do? When they failed to transmit, you had to use railroads, so they were heavily relied on. In rare occasions, the locomotives were used to destruct. Both sides wanted to end the war, so why not ram into other railroad facilities or tackle the opposing troops? Although these railroads were very useful, but because they were useful, they were also a target on both sides. The Union practiced this act of sabotage more than the Confederacy, so they placed armed troops near their rail lines. These railroads were often under the predation of large armies who had the goal of pulling the iron rails embedded in the ground. Troops heat the iron until malleable and then wrap them around trees. These wrapped trees were called Sherman neckties after William T. Sherman. Crazy man, only wanted destruction. Knowing that these trains would be targeted, armor was created to increase durability. But if you just put iron on it and then the train runs on firewood, that doesn't really balance out well. You know what I mean. So they created armors with holes in them to prevent overheating. And some of these batteries also contained positions to fire from. As the war went on, the usage of railroads increased in terms of battle and communication. With this, the railroad played a huge part in the Union's victory.
At the beginning of the war, the South had a huge advantage with superior leadership from Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, while the North struggled with inadequate leadership. After losing the first major battles of the war, the North recognized a need to improve the other technology they had at their disposal, and they realized that with their industrial strength, they could trump the South if they used their railways well. The Civil War was the first instance in which railroads made such a huge impact. There was great growth in the rail industry in the 1850s. By 1861, 22,000 miles of track had been constructed in the North and 9,500 miles in the South. The great rail centers in the South were Chattanooga, Atlanta, and most important, Richmond. Wars were fought to control supply centers and roads, but the Confederate government was slow to realize how crucial the railroads really were in winning the war. By September 1863, the Southern railroads were destroyed beyond repair. Railroad employees abandoned the Southern cause and its rails. Few Southern rails before 1861 were over 100 miles long. The South had always been less enthusiastic about the railroad industry than the North. Its citizens preferred an agrarian living and left the mechanical jobs to men from the northern states. The railroads existed, they believed, solely to get cotton to the ports, and were so blinded by this that they failed to see the real capabilities of railroads. competing railroad companies were not willing to cooperate to unite Southern rails due to economic competition. The rails therefore never met, and transferring freight to different lines was difficult and done by hand. The tracks had no standard gauge either. The track's width was not uniform across the South, unlike in the North. The railroads, therefore, began to run into difficulties very quickly. The South lacked the parts necessary to replace worn-out equipment. Before the war, Southern railroads imported iron from England. The Union blockade of the Atlantic and Gulf ports during the war was very effective in shutting off that supply. Without necessary replacement of the parts, locomotives and tracks began to wear out. The speed of train travel in the South had dropped from 25 miles an hour in 1861 to only 10 miles an hour by 1863. Another difficulty was that of fuel. Southern locomotives were fueled by wood, a great deal of it. In order to staff the military, skilled railroad workers were taken out of their jobs, and there were few people left to actually operate the rails. Replenishing rapidly drained supplies of wood became impossible. Supply ran so low that oftentimes railroaders resorted to chopping up just enough wood at the station they arrived at just to get to the next station. Train accidents mangled heavy metalwork and equipment. Telegraph communication was sporadic at best, so crews were uninformed of broken rails and collapsed bridges. Cattle watering onto the tracks, sparks from the locomotive's fires, and exploding boilers made the situation devolve further. The rails themselves even became a problem. Cross ties, spikes, and track were snatched from smaller lines and spliced into major ones. Cross ties rotted and rails broke. The line from Nashville to Chattanooga had 1,200 broken rails as early as 1862. Union troops obliterated Southern rails under General Sherman's instructions by uprooting and heating them until they could be wrapped around tree trunks, Sherman's neckties. They burned bridges, destroyed tunnels, and captured as much railroad equipment as they could. Their greatest catch was in 1863, when General Johnston abandoned Jackson, Mississippi, leaving 90 locomotives and hundreds of railroad cars behind. When Sherman captured Atlanta and cut off its rails, it was only a matter of time before the Confederate flag would fall. Overall, railroads had a huge impact on the war. Without hindering the Southern effort by destroying their lines, and without the strategic benefits the North had due to their railways, the war might have had the opposite outcome. Railroads and the development of technology after it were integral to the Civil War.